Are we ready? Okay, awesome.
Okay. We're ahead of schedule. I'm gonna start
By 2 minutes.
2 whole minutes.
Woo!
2 more minutes with fake geek girls. So, kidding. So I'm Ann Peterson. I'm with Chicago Nerd Social Club. We're really super pleased to be sponsoring the panel. I'm not really sure how
Actually, no, you guys have done a lot to really help promote the panel, and I would not have been able to pull this together without the vast amount of just awesome support Chicago Nerd Social has been giving. And you guys stand for really the kind of geek culture inclusiveness that really makes it awesome. So
yeah, that's really the aim of Chicago Nerds to some extent, is that we really love to include everybody, and all stripes of nerds are welcome, and please, participate in any kind of nerddom that exists, frankly. So we're definitely interested in organizing more out of normal nerd and geek culture kind of events. So please let us know if you have ideas. We love getting ideas from you guys. And we're very pleased with the turnout here, and I think there's as many people in here out there possibly waiting to get in, so I think that's really indicative that it's a really controversial and interesting topic that we really need to talk about. So without further ado, I'll turn it over. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Ann, and thank you to the Chicago Nerd Social Club for sponsoring our panel. And thank you all for joining us today. We're going to be talking about the fake geek girl phenomenon, issues of what makes a geek, who owns geek culture, who participates in it, and what actions we as creators and consumers of geek culture can do to ensure access for everyone. Our panelists today are Michi Trota. Michi is a writer and editor, a fire spinner, and a community organizer. Erin Tipton is a lighting designer, a knitter, and a devoted Whovian. Dawn Ziana Moon is a musician, a belly dancer, and a web designer. Carlin Meyer. Carlin is an attorney, a cosplayer, and a gamer. Laura Karofsky. Laura is a graduate student, a blogger, and a feminist activist. My name is Carly Frank, and I'm a geek. We do have one cancellation today. Jen Dollface, the jackass of all trades, cannot join us due to scheduling conflicts. Jen has been instrumental in getting this panel together, into the intellectual structure of the panel, but she's in training to be an EMT, so she has our support because she's out learning how to save lives today. We are going to reserve the last 20 minutes of the panel for Q&A. So if you can save your questions until then. If you do have a question, raise your hand, jump and shout, whatever you need to do to get our attention. So let's dive in, ladies.
All right.
woohoo!
The fake geek girl. Does she exist?
No.
I'd agree. No.
The idea of the fake geek girl is all based on the mentality of that someone else gets to arbitrarily decide who's a geek and who isn't. To term someone as a fake geek means you've put yourself in a position of judging them and their geekiness, and nobody has a right to do that.
I'd actually take the position that it doesn't matter whether or not some people out there, whether they're women or men, are even faking it, whether or not they're interested in geek interests or whatever, because I don't know if anyone last year read John Scalzi's piece, Who Gets to Be a Geek or Not? But he actually has a really good point that usually whenever there's someone usually points out that or thinks that they've discovered someone who's faking being a geek, there's usually one of two reactions. And the first one is, oh my God, look at that, fakey faker being fake over there. Let's call them out and shame them all to hell. And maybe if you do that, that gives you a momentary feeling of intellectual superiority. Or the other option is, oh, let's bring them in and show them why they should actually really love what I love and bring them into geek culture, which is a nice sentiment, but it kind of has some problematic assumptions in that you're assuming that they don't know what it is about geek, if they're faking being say a Firefly fan, or if they're faking liking comic books. You're assuming that they don't know what it is that they're faking being interested in, or that they even don't know it to begin with. Because obviously if they knew it, maybe they would love it just as much as you do. That's not really the point, because there's a third option. The third option is that you would just let that person do their own thing. Because here's the thing, that person's geekdom is not about her. It's not about you, it's all about her. It's all about that person's ability to express geekdom and participate in geek culture however the hell they want. It has nothing to do with you.
I want to make a little bit of a distinction too with two different things that tend to get conflated. There are geek girls who are, people who are just coming around at C2E2, whether they're in cosplay, whether they're not. And then there's the phenomenon of booth babes. These are people who are paid to be there. It's a job. I mean, they're not saying that they're nerds. They're not claiming any of that for their own. Their whole job is to look cute and to get you to come over and buy a company's product. So those things I think we should also keep as very distinct and separate entities.
Yeah, if you're going to be upset about the idea that there's someone using a physical appearance to entice you to buy a product, why be upset at that person and not be upset at the company that is using that?
If you're going to be upset about that, you better be prepared to be upset your entire life.
Yeah.
The entire advertising industry, because they all do that all the time. Every time you open a magazine or turn on a TV, there's someone super attractive trying to sell you something.
Yeah, there's a model trying to sell you a car, body wash, everything. It's not just geek culture that does it, it's everything. So you really can't pick on just that one aspect.
And I think there's also another thing too, where there's celebrities that want to take over geek culture and claim it as their own just because there is a kind of built-in audience there. And that I feel like is, again, something that's a little bit separate from the kind of things that we're talking about here, which are people that you're going to meet and come face-to-face in contact with. With a celebrity, I don't necessarily want to judge. Sometimes I get frustrated. I'm a musician. It's frustrating to me when I see somebody who's really not a musician put up a YouTube video dressing up, in cosplay or something, and claiming that they're a musician and getting a lot of iTunes downloads for their song that's not very good just because it talks about, Super Mario Brothers. So that can be a frustrating thing, but again, that's getting into something that's more commercial, and that's not a person that you're going to walk into. These people don't really exist, the fake geek girls that are walking around cons. We're convinced that it's a phenomenon that is something that it's a unicorn. It's something you hear about. It's not something that actually happens.
Yeah, it's a total witch hunt of just, okay, well, which one of these girls is not like, I see her costume, but I don't know. It's like, why are you trying to figure this out? It's okay.
Totally.
So in that line, the fact that the fake geek girl meme, or this idea, has become so pervasive in the last year, what does that say about gender relations in geek culture overall?
I think it's kind of indicative of a really interesting trend that I've noticed with, and this is something that we even talked about in our podcast, like, where have all these nerdy girls been all our lives? Well, we've all been right here. It's not like there's a new phenomenon of women saying, I'm nerdy. I'm not saying that there aren't women who are coming into their nerddom later in life. Some of our really good friends are. But I am saying that just because you didn't look up and see that there was a girl who was just as into gaming or just as into, your sci-fi or just as into everything that you were into when you were a kid didn't mean that we weren't all there. It's not a new phenomenon for there to be women nerds. But I think it's become this weird awareness shift of guys going, oh my God, look at all the women at this con. Look at all the women who are here participating and being active, and where were they this whole time? Well, we've always been here.
Yeah, I've always been very upfront about being a nerd. It was, as long as I can remember, being a nerd, being a geek has been a very important aspect of my identity. It was how I connected with my dad. It was how I connected with my mom. My mom used to be the one who actually ran the VCR, because as much as my dad would buy all of the technology, she's the one who actually read the instruction manuals and figured out how to set the VCR to record things like Robotech and Voltron, and He-Man, so we would go out and play in the afternoon daylight hours and do our homework, so then we would watch it after all of that stuff was done. But I think what the spread of the fake geek girl meme actually says about gender relations in geek culture is that it is really screwed up. It means that I think what's really troubling to me is that it shows that there's still this really weird underlying assumption that geek and nerd is still very heavily associated with male and masculine. Like the idea that there's a big perception that geek spaces are still default male spaces. And that the way that I used to think about myself was that I was a nerd or a geek despite being a woman. And it's been a very subtle, but I think a very distinctive and important shift that I now think of myself as a nerd and a geek and a woman. It's not separate, it's not something in spite of, because there are not, it's like thinking of myself that, I would think of myself as, I'm strong, I'm brash, I like doing nerdy things, I like going out and doing sports, I love reading comic books, and these were things that were associated as not typically feminine interests. I didn't do makeup, I didn't do fashion. I mean, Dawn and I have had these kind of discussions before where this is how we connected initially, was that we did not have these formative feminine gender expressions when we were growing up. And it was only later in life that we got very comfortable being dressing up girly. When I got dressed up today, I'm like, ooh, I have all these accessories, and I think I'm gonna wear a little makeup before I come on out today. And it took me a really long time to be comfortable expressing myself in a more feminine, normal, a normative feminine way, but still balance that out with I can still do that and still be nerdy. It doesn't mean that because I read comic books, I shouldn't be interested in also watching, say, Project Runway and enjoying that.
You
I
don't
can
have
do both
to
of
choose
them.
one or the other.
Yeah, totally.
I also kind of wanted to speak to, in terms of where the girls been this entire time, is that geek spaces have become a lot more accessible just logistically. I mean, I work at a lot of cons, and I'm always meeting people who this is their first con ever. These things are blowing up, and we have the internet now where you can get online and game with people you've never met. We have YouTube where you can say, here's a geeky thing I love, I'm putting it out there for the world. So to say I'm seeing women all the time now, it's it's the 21st century. They're going to be more visible. You're on the internet, and you're going to cons, you're flying, and you're seeing more of the world. And so it's really frustrating then when what you always hear is that the pushback for that is, these women, they're just doing it for attention. They just want to be seen, because it's they can be seen now, and that's okay.
And really, we can all be seen, just because, in the 90s, if you were associating with a specific group of nerds, that was all that you would really associate with, the people in your neighborhood, in your city, whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But, visibility for everyone means visibility for women too.
Mm-hmm.
And to say that we haven't been there before is just bullshit.
Make sure there were no children. Yes, yeah, we're good. Okay.
Well, it's also kind of if you were a girl, I feel when I was growing up and being nerdy, I kind of had to not be so girly to be in geek spaces, because it would kind of make the boys feel a little uncomfortable if I was more girly. They wouldn't quite know how to relate to me so much, so I was expressing myself as more of a tomboy. So you would it would feel like more of, they would be surprised when they remembered I was a girl. I would go to hang out at I was at the comic book store every Wednesday during high school. New Comic Book Wednesday, every Wednesday I was there. And every now and then it would, bring up things like, there's a dance at school, I'm trying to figure out what kind of dress I'm gonna wear. And they'd be like, oh, yeah, that's right, you're a girl. It's
You're
thanks,
a girl,
guys.
but you don't count.
Yeah, it's you feel you're a girl, but you're not like those other girls. I'm like, well, it takes you a while, but when you start getting older, you start realizing, wait, that's
really condescending.
And
It's
it makes
really condescending.
and it kind of pits you against other women, and it really took me a long time to realize that's not a healthy attitude to have.
Well, and that kind of segues into the idea of, there's a lot of women doing gatekeeping against other women too,
Yeah.
with the same kind of mentality of, oh, I've been a nerd my whole life, I had to, put aside these girly interests because of these interests or whatever, and so then you get, a super feminine girl who comes in, or even just a new girl, and there's very much an idea of like how women keep other women out because women have the mindset of I have to be the only woman in the group.
Yeah.
In a group of guys,
There's
there's
only
always
so much
that
room.
one woman.
There's only room.
And apparently you can't share that position. And it's a weird woman dynamic, but then you see women who have been nerds their whole life who are going, if this other girl comes in to my group and she's nerdy too, then where do I fit in? And it's not a matter of there's only one. You can all be nerds. It's okay. And you can all be women. It's okay. Like, you don't have to exclude somebody. And so it's not just a guy thing to judge very feminine women who say they're nerds as being fake. It's also a female thing.
We were talking earlier before the panel about this idea of part of gatekeeping comes from having suffered. Most of us, we grew up being nerds. This was not a cool thing. It was not okay. You were ostracized by everybody else around you for this, except for, small other little clump of nerds that you found. And I think for women, that's extra the case, you probably were, because there weren't so many of us who were willing to say, hey, I'm a nerd and I'm a girl. It was extra hard to be a girl. And it still is a lot of times in geek culture. It's extra hard to be a girl. And so you had to suffer more. So you know what? You're going to make that next person suffer more and prove that they actually deserve to be here. But how screwed up is that?
Like, it should be, I suffered all this crap, so how about you don't have to suffer all this crap? And I'm going to say, come on in and let's have a geek party.
Because really we want everyone to suffer.
Schadenfreude.
I'm glad you brought gatekeeping into the conversation, and I wanted to ask about specifically female gatekeeping and some of the insecurities that might reflect. Part of what we spoke about before the panel was this idea of limited resources within geek culture. We use a rhetoric that includes language like limited edition, special edition, and there's this idea that, even if it's not conscious, there's this idea that there's not enough to go around. And I'm also wondering if part of female gatekeeping might be female insecurity over trespassing in what has historically been a male subculture.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that this morning, and I think that kind of stems from partially the idea that if you look at how women participating in geek culture is presented in a lot of pop culture and mainstream. Let's look at Big Bang Theory, how every time they present Penny or Bernadette or even Amy, who is supposed to be she's this big uber science nerd, whenever they start talking about the guy's interest in comics or sci-fi, every single one of them is always like, geez, the guys are doing the whole comic book thing again. And it makes me think, when you think about how it's presented, women participating in geek culture is presented usually one of two ways. It's either a reluctant participation, where the women are pulled in, where they're kind of okay, fine, I'll go along with you to your convention because you're my boyfriend and I'm going to be the good girlfriend, but really I'm just going to be bored out of my skull while I'm there. Or they're unicorns and there aren't really that many girls who are actually wanting to go to cons or going to a comic book store of their own free will. And I think it actually perpetuates the idea that there aren't that many women who love geek stuff because they actually love it on their own merits. And it's part of this, it's not just geek culture that does it, it's mainstream culture that pushes this, that keeps perpetuating the idea that there aren't that many of us. But if you look at what the floor's been like here at C2E2, the gender spread is really, really pretty even. I've seen women all over the place for the past few days. And when I was putting together this panel, I was kind of tearing my hair out trying to figure out who I was going to ask, because I am blessed with a massive amount of really awesome geek women who are really into this and who really believe in talking about these kind of issues and have really amazing things to say about it. I mean, there were supposed to be 6 of us on the panel plus the moderator, and that was like, we're all squished here together at the table. So I think it's the idea that it's from this insecurity about trespassing is partially due to all of the false idea that there aren't many of us, and because there's only so much room, like what Tippy was saying about there's not enough room, and if there are going to be more, we're going to get pushed out of that space.
Well, and I think part of the other thing, like with the idea of limited resources and everybody wants to feel special, and everybody wants to feel special in their own interests. And I think there's kind of this not overt thought, but there's kind of the underlying thought of, well, if all these people start coming into my interest, will I still be special in it? And so there's kind of this elbowing for room of, you want to share your passion, you want to share your love, but you want to share it with a small group of people, because then you can be kind of together, and you can have that bonding thing. But when more and more people start identifying themselves the same way you do, how special does that make you? And so there's kind of this mentality of, we don't want to share our specialness. And that kind of leads to, oh, how long have you been a nerd? Oh, well, let me start asking you all these questions about that, comic book t-shirt that you're wearing. Or, oh, let me make you prove it, because I proved it and I'm special in my field, so why are you here?
There have been a lot of pieces written. Most recently, I think on Tuesday, there was one by Red Eye Chicago on how, if we can apply the word nerd or the word geek to so many people these days, and anyone can define themselves as a nerd of something or as a geek of something, does the word mean anything at all? And this is a problem for nerddom and geek culture, which, that has some validity. But on the other hand, if we are going to continue being a culture that closes off, that has entrance requirements, that shuts that gate and locks it, we're not going to have 50,000 people at C2E2 anymore. We're not going to have a panel like this where the line is twice as long as the room. We're not going to be called mainstream anymore. We're going to regress back to this exclusive community that does get beat up and thrown into lockers in high school. And I don't think any of us want that.
Well, it also completely shuts down dialogue. The dialogue stems from people with different viewpoints and ideas having conversations and learning from each other. If nobody new is ever allowed in, how do you learn anything? How do you not get a new perspective on your favorite show that you've seen 30 billion times, and all of a sudden somebody watches it for the first time and goes, oh my God, what about blah, blah, blah? And you never even thought about that because you've seen it so many times. Like, that's the whole benefit of new people and new influx and new ideas and conversations, like to learn more about who you are and what you love, as well as being able to share that with other people who love it too.
And I absolutely agree with that. I think that's another problem that kind of comes with gatekeeping, is that, you have people that might not necessarily agree with you. Like, yeah, they're passionate about, like the video game industry, but they think also there are some problematic things going on, and these are the things I would do to change it. And so do you say, well, you're not a real gamer, because I'm bringing this from the gamer angle, or you're not a real geek because you don't agree with the status quo, and you're not, just lining up with me on that. And so it does kind of allow geek spaces to really stagnate, where when people could bring in really creative other ideas for here's how we can make things more inclusive and just really reach more people and make this a better place, you can just kind of say, you're not the same kind of geek as me because you're not willing to accept this as it is. And I think that can also be really problematic, and I think it happens a lot.
And the sad thing is it's so easy to do that. It's so easy to say, if you don't agree with me, if you don't accept the status quo, then you're not part of this. Mm-hmm. But as you were just saying, that's how we grow as a community, that's how we grow as people, even, is learning to deal with other opposing viewpoints and sort of, either maybe we'll come to agree with them, maybe we'll see them as something completely different. But to shut them out is the instinctual, easy reaction, and it's a shame that happens.
So in this process of entering a new community, specifically entering into a geek community, is it more difficult for women than it is for men? Are women judged more harshly or asked to provide their credentials more often than men are when entering these spaces?
I have a favorite story about gatekeeping.
Oh, yeah. Actually, before you do that, I'd actually like to poll the audience. How many women here have ever felt like they've had to prove their geek bona fides? Yep.
Just about everyone.
Yeah, just about every single one. Okay, here you go.
So geek credentials. I mean, all of us have felt the need to prove them. Usually for me, I'm very comfortable wearing, the whole geek badge on my sleeve, and so if somebody challenges me on that, game on. Okay, I will out-nerd you. And I usually can.
Yeah, because
It's
you're not
very rare
competitive
that-
at all.
Right. I mean, it's rare that they win this game. So, last year at C2E2, I was wandering around Friday afternoon, just looking on the floor, seeing what was going on. And, they give us all these badges that say what we are, that have a speaker badge on, because I was speaking at a similar panel that we did last year. And one of the vendors looked at me and said, "Oh, is that your badge, or are you just borrowing that?" If I were a guy, what reaction would have never happened? It just completely took me aback. And yet every girl is kind of used to having to prove themselves in these ways. No, it's okay, I'm doing a panel later. And you just start explaining, and it hits you later how absolutely ridiculous that is. Because if you were a guy, the assumption would be you were speaking at something, "Oh, what's that thing? I would like to hear about it."
At least they didn't ask you if it was your boyfriend's badge.
Yeah, it's the assumption that you have to, oh, no, you're not in a position of authority. You have to establish that you're in a position of authority. It's not a default that, oh, you have something saying that, no, I'm in a position of authority. Here's my speaker badge. Oh, no, wait, are you borrowing it? Is that really yours? It's not that it's never questioned, it's that it's more often questioned.
Well, it's like
when-
that comic where the guy's
Yeah,
wearing the Green Lantern
the
shirt.
Green Lantern
the guy's
t-shirt
like, cool
comic,
Green
yeah.
Lantern shirt, bro. And then the girl's wearing it. He was like, and so all of a sudden, because it's a girl wearing it, she's getting 20 questions on, well, how much do you know about Green Lantern? What do you know about this? What do you know? And it's that kind of thing. Like you could, if a guy shows up in costume, everyone goes, oh, you totally know what you're doing. If a girl shows up in costume, people come up and start quizzing her to find out, oh, what do you know about this? What do you prove that you're wearing that costume because you like it, not just because you're wearing that costume to get attention or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, when I was younger, I used to take Dawn's track, which was I'm also extremely uber competitive.
Asians.
But it was kind of, I use my nerd identity as kind of a battering ram when I was younger, just to kind of be like, I am a nerd, I don't care what you say. If that means that I'm going to be lonely and ostracized, completely fine. You can just take it and shove it. And if somebody would come up to me in the comic book store and be like, oh, you're reading X-Men, don't you want the shoujo comics over there? Be like, no, really? You're gonna give me this? Oh, I know exactly everything about the X-Men going all the way back to Days of Future Past. And it would just be like game on, throw down exactly everything that I know. But now that I'm older and cranky and just do not have time for this anymore, it would be like, why do I even have to prove that I know everything about the X-Men just to get you to leave me alone about it? I should not have to say anything to justify my enjoyment of reading an X-Men comic other than I enjoy it. That's why I'm reading, that's why I have an X-Men t-shirt, that's why I have a comic book. It's because I enjoy it. That's the end of it.
What's really unfortunate though is when you take that tack, your options kind of come down to, I have to prove that I earned my spot here. Or I can look at you and say, you know what? Go fuck yourself. In which case, I'm the bad person.
Yep.
Automatically,
you're
I'm. Why are you so defensive? Why are you so hostile? Because I'm sick of having to prove that I belong here.
Why are you so angry, Tippy?
So many reasons.
Gamers also, in addition to all of that, you have you don't like the right kind of thing, and you don't excel at it to the level that I think you should. Because it's kind of funny when you have this name, like, I'm a gamer girl. Like, what does that mean? There are so many kinds of games. Are we talking video games, tabletop? If we are talking video games, console, Facebook games, is that legitimate enough for you? Like, there are so many different ways you can like games. But then you do hear things where people say like, oh yeah, she says she's a gamer, but all she does is play Mario Kart. It's like, is that not a game? Is that not one of the most popular games? Like, seriously. And so you find there's also gatekeeping of just like, yeah, well, you're not that in the way that I think you should be. but why do you get to determine that?
It's like, where does it stop? Really? I mean, where does it stop, and why should there have to be any kind of limit? And that's why it's problematic.
And that's the thing, I mean, everybody on this panel, I think, to some degree, has been guilty of gatekeeping ourselves in the past.
Yeah.
But you come to recognize that this is
Recovering.
Her name is Mitchie. She's a recovering gatekeeper.
Hi, Reggie. Okay, so since we've come right out and we've admitted that women are also guilty of gatekeeping, the million-dollar question that I know we're going to hear is, how can this then be called a sexist phenomenon?
Because it all stems from the misogynistic idea of women being inferior and women subscribing to the same idea. Like women internalizing the idea that we have to work harder and we have to prove more and we have to do more. And so then that perpetuates itself, you know? Guys approach it with, oh, you're a girl in geek culture, so you have to prove you deserve to be here. And we internalize that and say, oh, I have to prove I deserve to be here.
Well, it's also, I think, internalizing the idea that feminine is inherently less than masculine. And when you come into geek culture, there's a lot of it's not that geek culture should be considered masculine, but there's a lot of very heavy masculine tones in it. Like the way that I used to perform coming into geek culture was coming in with a t-shirt, coming in with, wearing jeans and not really, kind of playing up a lot of traditionally feminine garb. Like, the first time I ever actually experienced gatekeeping from women in a geek space was going to a meetup. I was actually in Chicago after we first moved here, and I actually went with my husband. And just for the hell of it, just because I felt like getting dressed up, instead of going in a t-shirt and jeans and sneakers, it's like, oh, we're going to be going to a bar. It might be kind of fun. I wore kind of like a shirt that was kind of like this. I had some earrings on. I was wearing kind of like some cute little platform shoes. And because I was there with my husband, and I kind of was getting this reaction where the women were sort of like not really talking to me so much. And I would start talking to people, and they were like, oh, wait, you mean you actually know this kind of stuff? I'm like, yeah, I do. I read Lord of the Rings. Oh, wait, you've seen the movies? Like, no, I've read the actual books. What is going on with this? And it took me a while to figure out that they were assuming, like, A, I was there because my husband was there and I was just tagging along with him. And B, it was also because of the way that I was dressed compared to a lot of the other women who were there, who were not necessarily dressed in what would be considered typically feminine garb. So there's a lot of internalized sexism, I think, is the problem, where you're denigrating what is considered feminine and elevating what is considered masculine. And that is, I think, a real problem, because there should be no elevating or denigrating of either. You can be masculine, you can be feminine, you can be a nerd in any way that you want. There should be no preferred way to express yourself.
It sounds so idyllic.
I know.
It's just like, oh, that's the dream.
That is the dream, and I know I'm overly optimistic.
And I just want to say real quickly, because that's precisely the kind of gatekeeper I used to be. When I finally got past guys saying, oh, girls can't play video games, and I showed them, like, no, I like first-person shooters, and I can kill you very easily. I'm good at that. And then when I would see girls coming in, and they're like, I'm a gamer as well, but I play, RPGs, where there's, like, a love interest and a storyline. And I was like, oh, my goodness, like, how are we the same? And there was a lot of kind of, I earned my stripes playing against the guys in death matches when there was a lot of Mountain Dew and profanity. And romancing All-Star and Dragon Age, and it was just kind of weird, but now it's like, no, these are all really good games, and it's okay, and thank you for bringing me into that world. But it is easy to just say, oh, that's the feminine part of it, but I'm doing the real thing, because I'm actually, doing it.
Yeah, and I don't know if anyone's ever read Elizabeth Simmons' comic, Manic Pixel Girl. If you haven't, it's really fantastic, and you should totally check it out. But she's been doing this strip where she actually talks about how she started out as a little girl loving games and buying her first console gamer and really, really playing them. But as she gets older into being an adolescent, she starts being a fake normal girl and putting it away in order to perform feminine gender. and kind of feeling like she was never really a real normal girl. And she rediscovers her love of video games as she gets older into her 20s. So there are a couple of panels where she kind of admits that she jumped on the fake geek girl bandwagon, where she's holding up signs saying like, "No fake geek girls. Anyone? Crickets in the background." And she's talking about how like, oh God, why is anybody not making a big deal out of it? These fake geek girls are a menace. They're being total bitches. And then little asterisk, not like I'm not being a bitch right now by typing this on my computer. Nobody really understands how much we suffered for this, and I was made fun of for doing this. Asterisk. Why am I assuming that they were not made fun of when they were growing up too? And there are all these assumptions just by looking at someone who is pretty and popular and who may be like saying, oh, I'm a geek now that I'm older and I've discovered how awesome this stuff is. How do you know that they were not made fun of? How do you know that they do not have their own experiences of feeling isolated or feeling ostracized for whatever? I mean, I don't know if you guys remember last year, Chris Abigail, who was on our panel, she was a popular cheerleader, and she did not come out with expressing how much she loved being a geek until she was an adult. But she shared what it was like when she was in high school, being like, oh yeah, me and my cheerleader friends, we actually would like watch Star Trek and marathon it at home, but we wouldn't talk about it. We wouldn't talk about it and when we went to school the next day, because it's like, oh yeah, really what we did was watch, Beverly Hills 90210, but really that Star Trek was awesome, but we couldn't say it in public. And it was coming out with it later, but she was the type of person who, I think, the fake geek girl people would look and are like, oh yeah, you're just saying that you're a geek now that it's easier for you to do it. Because she was a cheerleader and she was popular in high school. So why would you look at her now and assume that because she was a popular cheerleader that it was any harder for her, or that she didn't have those kind of experiences where we could connect over what it was like to be isolated?
Well, but I don't think necessarily that determining that, okay, so I never had those kinds of experiences.
Yeah, you didn't.
I was very, very lucky. I was brought up in a family that was completely supportive of being as nerdy and geeky as I wanted. I did theater from the time I was 8. So there's plenty of nerddom going on there. I got to go to a performing arts school where I had to audition to get in. And it was there were no sports. We had no sports in my high school. It was literally a school filled with performers and artists and musicians, and it was the most amazing experience ever. Because I was never beat up, does that mean I'm not a geek? Because I was never shoved in a locker? Because I was surrounded by people who were just as enthusiastic my whole life, I don't have the stripes and those badges of pain or what, I don't have that isolation and suffering factor. That doesn't mean I don't feel like a geek, to look at someone and say you don't know what their history is, doesn't matter what their history is.
Yeah.
What matters is how they're identifying themselves to you right now.
Well, it's also saying that it's not also to say that you haven't had experiences of feeling isolated in other ways either. It's not, you can empathize because maybe you weren't isolated for being a geek, but you have been, you might have felt isolated or excluded for other things. So it's not like we've all had those experiences in one way or another where we felt alone or we felt like you're faking being something in order to fit in or in order to be left alone so someone doesn't hassle you. Whether it's over being a geek or in your job because you're just trying to get away with something so your boss or your coworkers leave you alone. Everybody has had those kind of experiences, so you can empathize. Why not empathize instead of judging somebody? Because you can't know unless you're Professor X and you've got those telepathic powers. You can't know for sure that somebody doesn't know what it's like to be alone.
So what can we do with that empathy? Just very quickly before we open it up for questions, what is the solution to gatekeeping and to exclusion? What can we, as members of geek culture, as producers of geek culture, what can we do to make sure that it's an open place and a safe place, and most importantly, a fun place for our fellow geeks?
I mean, I think the big thing to do is just keep talking about this kind of stuff. Keep talking about it, keep writing about it, keep making people aware of the things that they might be doing, that they might be saying, because, you know, you admitted to being a recovering gatekeeper, but I'm pretty sure that, you know, I've done some of that, everyone up here has done some of that, and I'm not going to point fingers because I don't know most of you guys, but, you know, I'm pretty sure that everyone at some point has said, you're not geek enough for me, or maybe you're not up to my level, and that doesn't necessarily...
So sorry. I am so sorry. Please continue.
Something to separate you two.
I will behave.
But without telling someone, without making them aware that this is a phenomenon, Matt, that that happens quite often, and that it's destroying our sense of calling each other a community, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to be done about it.
I think we need also, on top of that, I think we need to quit making assumptions about what kind of geeks people are just by looking at them. Just because somebody is, we look at someone and think like, oh, that person's more attractive than me, or I think that person's attractive. Clearly they're here to get attention, or you know, they don't fit my picture of what a geek looks like, so I'm going to be more suspicious of who they are. I mean, like, you know, Daniel Craig, I guess, has gone on the record saying that he loves playing Halo, so yeah, he kind of feels like he's a bit nerdy. Okay, totally awesome for him. If he wants to label himself as a nerd, that's great. It doesn't have any bearing on how more or less I feel as a nerd. Just because he's an A-list celebrity and he wants to call himself nerdy, he likes playing Halo.
I think that kind of comes down to the fundamental of, you know, it's someone else's nerddom is not about you.
Yeah,
And
totally.
as soon as people stop assuming that anyone else's nerddom is about them, then I think that gatekeeping phenomenon and that exclusion will start to really wear away, because people will find that community and they'll find that sense of family, because they're accepting people as they come to them, not as they're putting their issues on them.
Yeah, it's not about somebody else's expression of nerddom is not about you, it's about them.
Yeah. Shall we do questions?
Yeah, I think it's the moment we've all been waiting for. Who's got a question for our panelists?
Okay, so my sister's fandom is actually sports and football in particular. And of course there is gatekeeping for that, and she has to prove her football bona fides. But nobody ever says to her, like, oh, you like football? What team does Derek Jeter play for? Like, they don't try to trick her or ask her questions about different sports, but...
Sports ball!
Yeah, but for me with Geekdom, I'll say, like, oh, I really love Doctor Who, and they're like, who's the leader of the X-Men?
Because that has to do with Doctor Who, how?
I'm like, because it falls under the umbrella of geekdom, I'm supposed to know all about it. Because I don't, I mean, I do know that particularly, but then I'm not really a geek. So my question is, do you think that maybe sexism in geek culture is perhaps more ingrained in even like sports culture? Like it's particular to men because it's so all-encompassing for guys than it is for, I don't know.
I mean, I do think that your sense is right, that it is more ingrained. I think all of us, especially the women in this room, have felt that, just even in what you're saying. Oh, you're a geek, now prove it, even in all of these things that I never even claimed to like. Oh.
Well, I think it's also for, there's a really, really cool piece on Comics Alliance kind of talking about how geek culture, the relationship between geek culture and expressions of masculinity. I really think you should take a look at it. It's talking. One of the things it talks about is how, for a lot of men in geek culture has been a kind of almost escape from very traditional heteronormative expressions of masculinity. The really heavy, you have to be aggressive, you have to be good at sports. Men who have come into geek culture came into geek culture to get away from that. So it's almost like there's a more hyper form of, we really need to be protective of who we let into geek culture. So a lot of that questioning of someone who does not fit the image of who gets to be a geek. You're like, oh, so you like Doctor Who. Do you like X-Men as well? Do you know everything about X-Men? Okay, you know about X-Men. What do you know about Lord of the Rings? What do you know about Star Wars? You have to prove like you have to jump through all of these hoops because there's a really protective instinct to know who's in the culture, because you're trying, I mean, like, I know for me, geek culture was really kind of an escape for a long time from the vagaries of mainstream culture, from feeling persecuted for being different. And when you're feeling persecuted for feeling different, you want to be very protective of who you let in. It's not an excuse, but it's something of an explanation, I think, for why there tends to be a lot of hyper protectiveness about who they're letting in.
I think partially people are afraid of being hurt.
Yeah, definitely.
I mean, we've all seen and I'm sure we've all experienced, having a crush on someone and them like completely dissing you because, oh, you're not cool enough or you're not whatever enough. And so I think when, in terms of like sports, women being interested in sports, that's not a new phenomenon. And guys just kind of take it as, oh, you're interested in sports? Well, prove it. Okay, you're good. Whereas in like nerddom, I mean, and this is going to sound really awful, and I don't mean it to sound the way it's going to probably end up sounding, but I mean, a lot of geeky guys have been really hurt by women judging them based on their interests. And so to be a woman coming into that culture, they feel like they have to not only play 20 questions, but they have to play 400 questions to make sure that you're legit enough that they're not going to get snubbed. And I think that's kind of part of why it's that much harder, is because, oh, the geek women haven't been around, so they feel like we have to prove more.
Yeah, and it's hard to say that without blaming other women for it, because it's not an excuse. Because just because you were hurt by one or two, like because you were rejected by somebody you asked out on a date, or rejected by a couple of people you were asked out on a date, doesn't mean you get to blame an entire gender for the way you were treated.
There's another question?
Mine kind of goes along with that. So there's a lot of other subcultures like sports or like certain types of music in particular that would practice welcome in. But I feel like in geek culture, the reaction to women is so much more violent. Like no one's gonna go, oh, you're a lady who plays basketball, I'm gonna rape you and cut your tongue out. But if you happen to put on the internet that you love video games, that's like a reaction that happens so much that we're almost used to it. Do you think that there's a reason that people are like so not actually acting out on those tendencies usually, but putting them online and like writing in comments, like there's so much violent imagery in the reaction to women in gaming and comics and other geek stuff?
I think part of it is a lack of accountability. When you're posting on the internet, you can say whatever you want, and people think that takes away that filter that goes, you would never in a billion years say this to anyone's face. But because it's over the internet and they can do it anonymously, they can be as heinous as their inner thought ever made them think. And there's no one to say, dude, that was dickish. What was that? Like, there's nobody there to call them to the carpet on it personally.
Well, Laura has a blog, and I think you've had a couple of comments every now and then you read about Doctor Who. So
yeah, I wrote an article about Doctor Who and the various companions in Doctor Who and how they're treated, and then I got this article cross-posted to a feminist website, feminspire.com. There was one commenter who wrote, I want to say 2,000 word comment response, and
it was twice as long as your article.
40 of those words were fuck. I counted.
And I mean, I'm sure, Carlin, you've experienced a lot of that being a girl in gaming and like the commentary and
I think that's something that we can really kind of see across the board with like the geek and gaming spaces is that, when you're mentioning, for example, like, oh, women, playing basketball and stuff, it's like, well, we've had this national dialogue, just this really open, like we have ESPN, we've had it for a really long time. Like when people want to talk about sports, they do it out in the open, and it's something that can be moderated and kind of treated with basic standards of decency and decorum. But like with a lot of these things, it's like, well, we've been playing games and it's been this very insular thing with just me and my buddies, and now we have the internet and I can talk to this girl and I don't know where she's come from, but she doesn't know who I am, and so I'm going to call her a cunt. And you can just kind of do that all of a sudden, So I think that partially because it's coming from these spaces that have been so in the dark, and now all of a sudden we're able to talk about it, and they don't know where I live. I think it's going to happen a lot.
Well, I think it's also when you start there's I think a new pushback now to not using gendered slurs. and to not using slurs in general, like gendered slurs, racial slurs. And when you start telling people like, hey, no, you just use this word and that is not acceptable, and suddenly you get the like, but free speech argument. And it's like, no, it doesn't matter if you're using language that hurts people. You should stop, and if you want to use insults, there is a dictionary full. The English language is full of extremely descriptive words that has nothing to do based on gender or race. You can just go back and use that. And it doesn't have to be based on a person's inherent qualities like race or gender or your genitalia. Please go and use that. And you're not actually going to be losing anything.
I think also people are scared. I mean, these spaces have been safe and comfortable for such a long time, and so male-dominated for such a long time.
They're safe and comfortable for small, specific.
Yeah, but I mean, having anybody new come into that is extra scary, and extra scary combined with the internet and anonymity is, you know, wreaking kind of havoc.
Okay, Miles?
One thing I was wondering about, sometimes the franchises that we're involved in, any sort of sexist content in the products themselves creeps up on us. But then it sounds like some of you also came into certain material later. I feel like first-person shooter is a pretty new mechanic. But then, like, how do you reconcile with the rampant sexism in a lot of this content?
Yeah, we fight it. And that kind of goes back to what I was saying before, where there are a lot of times where you can say, oh, I love this medium, I love this franchise, however, it's problematic in some ways and I'd like to change it. And there have been a lot of, I'm not going to go on this for too long, but like Jennifer Hepler, she was a writer for BioWare who basically said, you know, like, I write these games, I like them, and they asked her, like, if you could change one thing about it, what would it be? And she said, I would like to have a mechanic where you can skip fighting in the same way that some people have a mechanic where you can skip dialogue and just say, yeah, I see what they're saying, I'm gonna go fight. And she, of course, got death threats and rape threats, and this is the cancer that's eating the video game industry, just because she was thinking outside the box of like, this could be an interesting thing, and it's like, that's the way you should think, just, you know, come up with ideas and stuff. And I mean, it's the same thing you see where if people can say, yeah, this game, there's some sexist things going on here, I love this, I want to change it, I want to make it better, and then it turns into, oh, then you just don't love it enough, you're just not a real geek, this is what, you're the problem with it. But you should be able to love something, critique it, and want it to be better.
And in some ways, I think the more you love something, the more you realize all the ways it falls short.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, I think we have time for two more. So you?
So Mitchie, there was a couple of things that, off of what you said, I remember on one end of the spectrum, you were not a girl. You were so much like you were saying jeans and a t-shirt means you're not a girl. And then at one point, if you dressed up a little bit more nicely, then all of a sudden you were too much of a girl. And there's a lot of stuff about how relatively girly, or is it fair to say that relative attractiveness inside a situation has a big bearing on this? Like, what is the attractive or the hot factor? How does that fit?
Attractiveness, relative, and actually I was making notes about this. Attractiveness, whether or not a woman is perceived as attractive by anyone, should have no bearing at all on on whether or not she is perceived to be a geek. It really shouldn't, because geek culture is made up of more than just hetero males. There are transgender males, there are gay, there are queer. It's made up of geeks who come from all walks of life. And whether or not somebody finds me attractive or someone finds me not attractive, it should have no bearing on whether or not they think I'm a geek or whether or not I'm perceived to be a geek. My issues of how I feel I perform gender as a woman are my issues and nobody else's. And that is not fair for me to project how I feel about performing gender onto another woman and looking at her and saying, oh, I feel that she's prettier than me. I'm going to be a little bit more circumspect about how she is, whether or not I think she's a geek. That is not fair. That is what I used to do, and I'm not doing it anymore.
One of the things about being...
Sorry, she's had her hand up so long that her arm went numb. like it was falling over.
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just going to say one of the realities of being a woman, for better or worse, and I mean, most of the time it's not that great in this particular instance, but I mean, how we dress, how we look, how we carry ourselves has a huge bearing on how people treat us, and whether outside of geek spaces even, whether or not we're perceived as competent or whether or not people think we're intelligent. And it's a terrible thing, but this is like society at large. It's something that we're used to. So in a lot of instances, if you look too attractive, I mean, there's some bar. If you're if you're not attractive enough, people don't take you seriously. But if you're too attractive, people automatically think you're not very intelligent and you don't actually know what you're doing.
And we don't know where that bar
So you
is
can't
set.
win.
No, there's no way to win.
Yeah.
What was your question?
I have kind of a two-part question. I consider myself a geek in
Could you, sorry, we can't really hear it back. Would you just mind speaking up a little bit?
I got this. So I consider myself a geek in like the comic book and gamer realm, and I know that as far as like the spectrum of geekdom, it's always, there's not many characters or representation of women in a positive or powerful light. There's often like a damsel in distress, especially with like first-person shooters. Sometimes there's not even an option to play as a woman, or you're always saving a woman. Way back from Mario Brothers. Do you think that is gatekeeping in itself to keep women from playing the games or getting interested in the comic books? And B, do you think that that is part of the reason why people have such a negative look on women, because they're playing these games and they're reading these comics where the woman is always the lesser character, so why would the woman be considered the lesser nerd? Or
I think it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah. I don't think it's on purpose.
I think it's a marketing thing. Like with the new BioShock game, and they wanted to put the girl on the cover, and they were told no, that we refuse to produce your game with, and I've gone completely blank on her name now, but yeah, on the cover. Like they were like, no, we will not market your game if she's on the cover. And I think that it's not because they hate women. I think that it's the target marketing plan that they've said, this works and we're not going to deviate. And I think it's the reason it's a self-perpetuating cycle is because they continue to do that, and then their stats are upheld by guys continuing to buy those games, or anyone continuing to buy those games. So then they think that's a winning formula, so then they keep doing it. And so it's an endless cycle until the demand from their audience forces them to start shifting.
And that's where a lot of the pushback comes from as well, because you do have, males in the 18 to 35 demographic. They're white also. These are the people for whom video games are made. And so when they can say, or not even consciously say it, but you can look and see that all these games up to this point have been made with me in mind as the target audience. And then all of a sudden you have people coming in and saying, I'd like to see a little more representation, a little more inclusivity, a little less sexism, maybe some people of color. And it's just like, why are you trying to change everything about games?
Yeah, wasn't that a big deal when they did, was it Dragon Age 2, when they had romances that were actually same sex, and suddenly like everyone like, why are you putting that in there? You're ignoring you're ignoring your straight male demographic. And they're like,
Nobody's ignoring the straight white male. Calm down. He's not going anywhere. He's just fine.
But yeah, so you get like this extra persecution complex of like, I have this thing and it was mine and now you just want to take it away from me. But it's like, that's a beautiful thing to happen, and I promise you will still be catered to, but it's still
Well, and I also think that women who are making video games are, there's smaller numbers of them. So if you have a lot of guys making a video game, just probably by default, they're going to think, well, the main character should be a guy, and sort of build things accordingly. So it's not necessarily always even a marketing thing. I think sometimes it's just the context people are starting with and thinking, well, clearly everybody thinks like me. So if you get a few more people in the video game industry maybe who are women, maybe you'll start to see the games change a little bit.
Well, here's the thing about sexism that's really, I think, the major problem is that a lot of people have the perception that sexism to be a problem has to be overt and
it has to be
intentional.
It
Unintentional,
doesn't have to be intentional.
No, unintentional, unexamined sexism is a much, much bigger problem in geek culture, I think, than overt intentional. Because, I mean, that piece that started the whole, that I really think started the whole fake geek girl problem last year, the piece by Joe Peacock on CNN about, fake geek girls, we don't need you or whatever. When Joe Peacock wrote it and he got all that massive blowback, he was like, I wrote something that I thought was supportive of geek, like real geek women in geek culture. What did I do wrong? He actually he appeared on John Scalzi's Who Gets to Be a Geek discussion board for that piece and was like, I don't get it. What did I say? I thought I was being supportive, and people were trying to point it out to him, what he was writing and why it was problematic, and he just wasn't getting it. because there were a lot of unexamined, unexamined internalized issues of inherent sexism that he just wasn't getting. And I think that's a lot, everybody has it, that we swim in a sexist culture. Everybody has those issues. I have them, everybody on the panel has them in one form or another. And what really makes the difference is when you actually look at how you have those issues and you're willing to be challenged, you're willing to pull them out and look at them and admit that, well, maybe I may have made mistakes in the past. Don't flagellate yourself over it. Be willing to move forward and try not to make the same mistakes and have somebody talk to you about it. Be willing to be challenged, be willing to re-examine your assumptions.
Okay, ladies, we are going to move forward because they're going to come and take the room away from us.
Oh.
I know, it's all the time we have. We want to thank C2E2 for having us. Big thanks to the Chicago Nerd Social Club for sponsoring the panel, to the people who volunteered to make this possible, of course, our incredible panelists.
And thank all of you guys
Thank
for
you
showing
guys.
up.